We are all coming through a period, and one that is still not at an end, where many of us had a feeling, I think, some of us, at least at the beginning of all this, that civilization might end. Although I have to admit, it probably was only discussed amongst a few of us. And we learned the hard way that the complex interlocking dynamics of our world had exposed some of the most basic absurdities at the heart of how our global society is constructed. I think the experience of the lockdowns that were induced by coronavirus had a very strange effect. I think it intensified the feeling that the boundaries that were supposed to protect us were in fact collapsing. I also imagine the same pandemic, but with the technology and infrastructure we had in 1980 or 2000 instead of 2020. It would have been a very different experience, I think, for most people. I know that's obvious, but so it goes. Technology let a lot of people muddle through COVID-19 in relatively low-risk ways. School, I think, is the most obvious example and the most close-to-home example. Yeah, online teaching was a bummer, but 2020, it could be done with audio and video. I don't know how that cuts, though. With 1980 tech, you might have had more complete shutdowns because there were no online options. And then again, you might have had no shutdowns, greater risks, because life simply could not stop. There's an author friend of mine writing The COVID-19 Pandemic, an Imagined History. And that should be a very interesting read as he tries to look at COVID-19 from the standpoint of 1980. I think the vaccines, though, have been the game changer in getting things back to normal, although I think normal is going to be debated for a very long time. But remember that a normal vaccine rollout, from development to introduction, has taken 4 to 5 years at a minimum, and many times longer. But in this instance, it was accomplished in a year and a half, and that's simply amazing. 10 or 20 or 40 years ago, we wouldn't have had the technology for these vaccines, nothing like we have today, and so contingent, much like life itself. And I think the penetration of the internet into every corner of our lives meant we were bound into this massive global information network. The pandemic reinforced the sense that we were all entangled in some kind of planetary catastrophe, even if its effects were unevenly distributed. And one important point, COVID is an enemy which has no side. Whoever your enemy or your country's enemy has been, there's always been a very clear character that brought you to grief. That's how our reality works. It's maddening, but we've all learned to process life just like that. But with the coronavirus, it was clearly none of the above. There was no us, and there was no them. We experienced many things in 2020, and for many of us, they were deeply painful. But many finally crossed a critical threshold that most of us, at least those of us in the West, have known for a very long time. And that is that the world has become techonomic. Tech has decisively become fully entwined with the functions and institutions of society, politics, and economics. Digital platforms have integrated themselves into every fabric of our social, economic, and political lives, and there is no escape. This past year, even the most obtuse could not fail to witness technology's power all around us for both good and ill. Tech's preeminence as a force, as an agency, as a vehicle, as an instrument, was everywhere evident during this entire year and a half. So for most of us, at least the audience listening to this keynote, we were privileged to have such connections at the end because we used them as an isthmus to connect our quarantined homes to the larger world, to work, to shop, to stay connected to friends in myriad ways, even to engage in politics, and to do so many little things that make life good. Many did not have that privilege, that luxury. But it all seemed to bring home that we live in an inherently unstable system. Everyone's connected, but nobody's in control. The world is always in overdrive with this relentless acceleration in human development over the past 2 centuries. We are living longer, producing more, consuming more, devouring energy and space on an unprecedented scale, and generating waste and emissions in tandem to that. To paraphrase Mary Bateson, who was a writer and the daughter of the cultural anthropologist Margaret Mead, the great irony of our time is that even as we are living longer, we are thinking shorter. And perhaps the pandemic was nature's revenge on our voracious species. We all learned quite a bit in retrospect now, and many Western health experts, we realized, were too focused on capacities, such as equipment and resources, and not enough on capabilities, which is how you apply those capacities, whether you have them at a high level or low level, in times of crisis. As scores of experts pointed out, many rich nations had little experience in deploying their enormous capacities because most of them never had outbreaks. By contrast, East Asian and Sub-Saharan countries that regularly stared down epidemics had both an understanding that they weren't untouchable and the cultural muscle memory of what to do. More importantly, we were all reminded that the glue holding modern societies together is alarmingly fragile, with devastating consequences that we are only now beginning to understand. But the lockdown also has created another type of wake-up call. A good call, I think. In the past year, we have all been forced to re-examine our daily rituals, our social boundaries, and our unstated cultural assumptions that we used to ignore. And as we begin to return to this normal, whatever it is, in the next year, hopefully, we will also need to work out what cultural and social patterns we want to preserve in this more digitized world. This past March, I wrote a long essay about COVID, and I tried to capture all the things we learned in that first year. And I included in that piece one of my favorite quotes, and it's from the evolutionary biologist E.O. Wilson, from a book he wrote in 2012. In that book, he said, "We have created a Star Wars civilization with Stone Age emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology." And I think we'll all admit, it's been a bizarre year and a half. COVID-19 was preceded by massive forest fires in Australia and the US. Political polarization intensified across the US and Europe. The continuing police killings of unarmed blacks triggered riots and demonstrations across America, etc., etc., etc. It was never ending. In the data technology world, the world that is the focus for most of this audience at this conference, America was hit by a massive cyber attack by Russia called SolarWinds. We saw the takedown of EncroChat, the massive Europe-based communications network and service provider used by organized crime members to plan criminal activities. We saw continuing massive and recurring data breaches and ransomware attacks. We saw the Accellion breaches, which devastated banks and law firms. And we seemed to see artificial intelligence that was just going wild. And in the last few weeks, we saw the most escalated cyber infrastructure attacks in America on an oil pipeline, and a meat processing plant. As Andy Jenkinson notes, his cyber team receives 10 to 20 cyber attack notices a day, which his team analyzes. And you meet Andy tomorrow in my SolarWinds panel. Meanwhile, this week, it was announced that the FBI, in cooperation with Europol and various European Union law enforcement agencies, carried out the largest and most sophisticated law enforcement operation to date in the fight against encrypted criminal activities. The war goes on. And we found out the FBI obtained the key to one of the Bitcoin wallets of the Russian cyber attackers who hit the Colonial Pipeline, depriving them of several $million of the ransom that had been paid. But we'll deal with all of this and more tomorrow during that SolarWinds panel. It's been a cacophony. We simply can't process it all. And that's why I say, and why I've titled this keynote, it seems that life itself has become the virus. It was all like Carl Sagan said many years ago. We're living in a society exquisitely dependent on science and technology, in which hardly anyone knows anything about science or technology. But the dynamics of global insecurity, the digital, the technological and otherwise, and all those related threats, plus the mind-boggling technology complexity we face, these are all something that most of us in this audience have been talking about and have been dealing with for years. For the cybersecurity vendors you will meet at this conference today and tomorrow, they have been sounding the alarm for decades, but most of the world just keeps hitting the snooze button, failing to wake up and deal with these threats. As for all of these vendors, whether they be from the cybersecurity side, the digital investigation side, or the open source intelligence side, cyber attacks and data breaches have mostly meant, up until now, some customer data loss, maybe some identity theft, maybe some fraud losses, all bad, but nowhere near in the same league of concern that the Colonial Pipeline Company and other infrastructure attacks have foreshadowed. These are all merely a preview of potential coming attractions, a next-level threat that scares the HTML out of security professionals. But for most of us, the past year, it's been a teaching opportunity for our clients and our colleagues. In the simplest of terms, I have told clients that you need to take a look at data technology as two prongs. One, software that drives information, commonly referred to as information technology, IT. And then software that enables operations, commonly referred to as operational technology, OT. IT runs the books, OT runs the factory. I've simplified it, of course, but you need to take a granular approach. Start at the top and then work your way down the funnel. The vendors you meet today and tomorrow during this event will tell you about the immensely increased complexity we are now all facing. And we're facing it because of increased network density, microservices, layered segmentation, shadow IT proliferation, misconfigurations, hybrid cloud, the absence of sufficient security by design, poor hygiene, overworked analysts, deep tool stacks, understaffed teams, and, let's face it, a lot of uneducated clients. You throw in the upcoming challenges of 5G speed, which is now just seeing its first in real life application, and yikes, the future is going to be crazy. We rarely talk about how we got here, and it wasn't just a combination of the COVID-19 pandemic and this push for digitization across all of society. The complexity trend has been well on its way for years. When the IRENA team was planning this conference, there was a laundry list of topics. When you look at the complexity of network systems, the vulnerability of those network systems, and the investigations of those systems, you can't unpack everything in 2 days. It's just too much. Had we all been sitting in the comfort of a conference room in that wonderful hotel that overlooks Lake Zurich, and we had a full 4 days, maybe we could have cast a wider net. So I think the Arena Brain Trust was wise in reviewing its wide-ranging customer base, its vendor base, and its general audience base, and chose 3 primary areas to focus on today and tomorrow. 1, traditional digital investigations. 2, cloud investigations. And 3, open source intelligence. Each of the vendors you meet today and tomorrow will demonstrate the skill sets required in data technology, whether they concern traditional data collection techniques or forensic investigation in the cloud. The availability of massive computation power and storage facilities makes this process doubly hard. And now just a few closing comments on open source intelligence, which is near and dear to my heart because it helps me in my cybersecurity work. Unfortunately, much like other major subtypes such as human intelligence, signals intelligence, geospatial intelligence, to name but a few, open source intelligence, I think, is widely misunderstood and misused. Open source intelligence is derived from data and information that is available to the general public. It's not limited to what can be found by using something like Google or Firefox, the so-called surface web, but that's an important component. As valuable as open source intelligence can be, information overload is the real concern. Most of the tools and techniques used to conduct open source intelligence initiatives are designed to help security professionals, and even threat actors, quite honestly, focus their efforts on specific areas of interest, and it is an art form. And there is that dark side, because anything that can be found by security professionals used to protect can also be found by threat actors. Generally, the term open source refers specifically to information that is available for public consumption. If any specialist skills, tools, or techniques are required to access a piece of information, it can't reasonably be considered to be open source. But crucially, this is the point. Open source information is not limited to what you can find using the major search engines. Web pages and other resources that can be found using Google, for instance, certainly constitute massive sources of open source information, but they are far from the only sources. For starters, and let me hit you with a number, a huge proportion of the internet, over 99%, cannot be found using the major search engines. All that information is in the deep web, which is a mass of websites, databases, files, and more than that, for a variety of reasons, includes the presence of login pages and paywalls. None of that can be indexed by Google, Bing, Yahoo, or any other search engine you care to think of. Despite this, much of the content of the deep web can be considered open source because it is readily available to the public, and that's why you need open source intelligence experts. Today and tomorrow, you're going to learn how these companies can help you, all of them, in every segment of the digital investigation or intelligence problem you're facing. And I want to leave you with one last point, and that's complexity. Take a look at this graphic. In May 1973, the internet had 42 computers, the squares, and 36 nodes, the ovals. Today, we're in the billions. The author of this chart is unknown. It was found a few years ago in the archive of the Carnegie Mellon School of Computer Science in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in the US, where it is believed to have been originally written. Significantly, if you look at it, you see that Hawaii appears as its own node, linked to the mainland by satellite. They continued to update this map, but then it simply became impossible. And a related thought. In 1947, William Shockley and his team invented the original transistor, which was about the size of a small dinner plate. And you can see this historical photograph from a few years ago. That team would then go on to win the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1956. Now, the new A11 chip here in my iPhone 12 has some 4.3 billion transistors packed into it. Can anyone imagine trying to make a phone call today while balancing 4 billion dinner plates? So imagine what technology is out there today at the stage where the internet was in 1973 and where that technology will be in 50 years. These are all great illustrations, I think, because even though it is all around us, people miss the speed of transformation and what it means for society. It's impossible to stop technology that empowers people, but quite frankly also empowers power. Exponentially increasing change, the acceleration of technological progress, which often leads to social regression and not progress, means upheavals in human history, both technological and societal, has become nearly a daily occurrence. The French philosopher Maël Renoir combines the word velocity and occurrence, and he created his own world called Volcurrences. Today and tomorrow, Arena and its partners are going to help you unpack some of those Volcurrences. I hope you enjoy the event, and thank you for your attention.